Michael Mandelbaum from SAIS, School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, and our neighbor and partner. And I am so happy that you're with us to talk about your new book, Michael, called Mission Failure: America and the World in the Post-Cold War Era. You spend a lot of time in this book talking about what went wrong in the post-Cold War era. The U.S. looking for benchmarks of success, not finding them. You basically suggest that we didn't really get our toolboxes readjusted to a post-Cold War era. And in some ways, I think that one of the things that comes out of it, especially now in the context of this election campaign that we're having, I want to extract from this book, well, what is it that we should not be doing as well as what we should be doing? And I think you talked about that a lot. You can't transform people's heads. You can use military to change the equation of things, but you can't always change people's minds or their structures unless they want to. So in assessing where you went and found these case studies where you said that didn't work too well, this didn't work too well, explain in a few sentences why it didn't work and then what lessons we can draw out of it, because I think just a few weeks before the election in November, what should the next president of the United States be taking from the book that you wrote?
Well, thank you, and thanks for inviting me to this interview. The premise of Mission Failure is that with the collapse of communism in Europe, the United States found itself in an historically unique position with no great power rivals. It was completely secure and bestrode the world like a colossus, which meant that it had a very wide choice of the foreign policies that it could carry out. And what it chose to do, in a number of instances that I detail in the book, is what we wrongly call, or misleadingly call, nation building, but is really two closely related things. One is nation building, creating a sense of community among disparate peoples, and the other is state building, establishing the institutions of modern governance where they do not exist. In all of these episodes, the United States failed. And it failed, in my view, for one common reason, although for a lot of separate reasons as well. And that common reason is that outside powers cannot create a sense of common national destiny, and they cannot build by themselves institutions of modern governance. And that's what we tried to do in various ways, in various guises, in Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo, in the initial Clinton policies toward Russia and China, in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the wider Arab world. And I cover each of those cases and explain how and why I regard them as failures. So there is a lesson to be taken from this, and that is state building and nation building are not promising exercises. Other countries can assist peoples who are moving in that direction, but we cannot do it for them. But there's another and even more important lesson, I think, for policymakers, and that is that the basic defining condition of the post-Cold War era, when the United States was free to engage in these missions, is now at an end. The United States and its allies in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East do face real security threats. Power politics, security competition, whatever you want to call it, has returned to the main centers of interest for American foreign policy, and American foreign policy has to adjust to that fact. In Europe, Russia's invasion and occupation of Ukraine did away with the peaceful post-Cold War era there. In East Asia, it's China's aggressive maritime policies, and in the Middle East, it is Iran's bid for hegemony. So I think what is needed for the United States is basically a change of mindset, a realization that we are back in a world that more closely resembles the Cold War than the 25 years after the end of that conflict. Now, that doesn't mean that we have a full-scale return of the Cold War. These are regional threats. They don't have ideologies that they're trying to spread all over the world. They're probably not going to try to seize lots of territory, although the Russians have done that modestly. Nonetheless, the United States and its allies have to think about reinvigorating deterrence in new circumstances. And what that means for Europe, what that means for NATO, is that it has to think hard about deterring Russia, especially in places that are not very easily defensible by ground troops, namely the three Baltic states. They are in some ways the equivalent of what West Berlin was during the Cold War. But a necessary condition for that, for a renewed commitment and for rethinking, is for the European members of NATO to contribute more to the common defense. Donald Trump likes to complain about that, although he seems to think that NATO, like everything else, is a real estate deal, and success depends on how much money you can get from other people. That's obviously not true. NATO is not and was never meant to be a paying proposition for the United States in those narrow terms. But it's also the case that President Obama was willing to say publicly that the Europeans are free riders. Now, in some sense, they certainly are and have been since at least 1952, and every American president since Eisenhower has wanted the Europeans to do more, to contribute more, to pay more, but none of them before Obama has ever said that publicly. What this means is that whoever is elected, whether it's Mr. Trump or Mrs. Clinton, getting the Europeans to contribute more, making NATO more of a partnership, will be near the top of the American political agenda and will require a response from the Europeans.
So knowing what you just said leads me to think, okay, so the 25 years after the wall came down in 1990 was thought about in Europe as a kind of beyond nationalism and supranationalism, and the U.S., as you just said, was basically the power of the world. And because of that, we thought we had basically, as our colleague, former colleague at SAIS, Fukuyama said, the end of history was nigh. Now you seem to be suggesting, though, that the end of history is not over, that we have almost reverted back to national or realpolitik in the old 19th century sense. So when you suggest that, for example, NATO has to be upgraded monetarily and militarily, is that enough? Because, I mean, as you made the comparison that the Baltics are like the Berlin situation in the Cold War, is a tripwire. But does that solve the problem? Because of the fact that we have a antagonistic Russia at the moment, we'll have other antagonistic partners out there. What tools should be in the toolbox, I guess, is my fundamental question, that allows us to deal with what you are describing as almost a return of the national politics that even go back to the 19th century, early 20th?
The normal course of international politics, with rivalry between and among the great powers, has returned, but it hasn't returned in precisely the form it took during the Cold War or in the 19th century. The aggressive tactics that Russia, China, and Iran have adopted do not, at least so far, and with the exception of Ukraine, involve marching countries across sovereign borders to capture territory. And even in Ukraine, Putin tried to disguise the Russian role in the assault on Crimea and the Donbass. Moreover, Russia, China, and Iran are not particularly strong. China is growing stronger, but it doesn't have a global reach. Russia is in every way failing, except militarily, where it's doubled defense spending in recent years. And Iran is strong only in comparison with the other Middle Eastern countries, with the exception of Israel, which are extremely weak. So deterring them is not as difficult as it was in the 19th century and as it was thought to be during the Cold War. But it does require some serious effort and some serious thinking on the part of NATO. But Putin's aggression against the Baltics so far has mainly consisted of cyber attacks and trying to stir up the local Russian population, the ethnic Russian population. So the burden of responding to Russia falls very heavily on the countries that are targeted to make sure that they are politically and socially cohesive enough that these Russian tactics don't work. And in Ukraine, The most important thing that can happen is for Ukraine finally to be a functioning state and a cohesive society. And although Western Europe and the United States can help with that, that's ultimately up to the Ukrainians. But there is another concern here, another question, and that is, will the United States sustain its commitments to a certain kind of order in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East? And that, I fear, is far from certain. Mr. Trump is in some ways an outlier, but he does give voice to a feeling of fatigue, as well as a feeling that the Europeans aren't as grateful as they ought to be. I don't think those are Mrs. Clinton's views, but ultimately it is public opinion that determines American foreign policy. And if the public decides that it is weary of supporting the kind of globalist, internationalist American foreign policy that has been in place really for 75 years, then that policy will not continue. The most serious threat to that policy at this point comes not in the security sphere, but in the economic sphere. The United States has been one of the mainstays of the open international economic order since Bretton Woods in 1944. And the chief instrument of American policy has been an open trade policy. Not only is Mr. Trump opposed to an open trade policy, so is much, if not most, of the Democratic Party. Senator Sanders made that one of his key issues, his argument that trade deals have wrecked the American economy. Mm-hmm. Economists will tell you that jobs have been lost through trade, but most jobs have been lost through technological progress. It's robots and digital equipment that are doing jobs that used to pay decent salaries to Americans. But you can't blame technology, so you blame foreigners. But that sentiment is sufficiently strong in the Democratic Party that Mrs. Clinton, who used to be a free trader, has now retreated from her support of the pending American trade treaty, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I think that where the American role in the global international economic order is concerned, we're in for some rocky times no matter who is elected. I don't know whether that will be true as well for the security order, but it might conceivably be.
So if that's the case, and we're going through that process right now, we may see as a tradition that goes back many decades, if not centuries, in the U.S. Foreign policy context, this debate between what is it, John Quincy Adams, we shouldn't go out searching for monsters, versus the let's make the world safe for democracy. That debate's been going on for a long time. Sounds to me like what you're saying is that there may be a trend toward let's not go out and look for monsters anymore. And to some extent, you suggest in the book that the United States doesn't really have the tools to do that as it had 25 years ago. Let's assume that's the case, because a lot of people are talking about that. The U.S. is beginning to kind of recede and at least begin to think about where it's not going to be as opposed to where it should be. What relevance does that have for the way Europe now looks to you, in the sense of a continent that has been now running since, 6-7 decades on the premise that Europe will ever be more, it will be expanded. You saw the European Union expand like you saw NATO expand, although you think that's one of the most cardinal mistakes that we made in the last 25 years, NATO expansion. I'll come back to that in a minute. But what do you see happening from your perspective in Europe, where some people would say the threads of all of this effort to put together a European Union project are beginning to unravel?
First, I think it's important to make a distinction between the attitude that is generally, although misleadingly called isolationism, and what I'm talking about. What George Washington said in his farewell address, which is the urtext for what is misleadingly called isolationism, was in effect, let's not get involved in European affairs because we're too weak, we can't really affect them, they'll get sucked in, we'll get sucked in, it will be no good for us. Let's just stand aloof. Well, that was true in the 18th century. The United States was weak. It's not true in the 20th or 21st centuries. So I think that advice is passé. I would make a distinction not between involvement and non-involvement. And in this globalized world, in this era of intercontinental ballistic missiles and the internet, the United States just can't retreat from the world. It's not practical. I would make the distinction between doing what the United States has done since the end of World War II and done effectively, that is, help to organize security orders and economic orders in Europe and Asia, which has been very successful. And on the other hand, and quite distinctly, trying to remake the societies and governments of countries that are very different from the United States and Western Europe, where in the 25 years of the post-Cold War era, the United States was not successful, and where, for the most part, major American interests were not involved. Now, on Europe, it seems to me that Europe has major problems, all apart from whether or not the United States sustains its commitment to European security. In fact, in my view, Brexit is only the third most pressing challenge that the Europeans face, after the euro and immigration. Those are issues that the Europeans will have to solve themselves. There really isn't much of an American role to play there. And I don't know how they will solve them, and I don't think the Europeans know at this point. I think it can properly be called a crisis or two crises. What I do think is that given the turmoil that Europe is going through, this is the worst time for the United States to abandon its commitment to protect Europe against external aggression. We can't sort out Europe's internal difficulties, which are massive, but we can keep in place the security structure within which Europe did integrate, and within which, if it's going to disintegrate, it could do so peacefully.
We did that. I mean, in effect, after the alliance was formed in 1948, I mean, we basically provided a security zone for Europe to grow in a way that it did. So we've been doing that for decades. You're going to say, I think, in the same breath, yes, and we should continue to do that, providing that Europe can also be a little bit more supportive or more supportive of that joint effort. Let me ask you for a kind of an etymological derivation of a concept you use in there, which is called gardening. At the very end of the book, you talk about gardening as a way of understanding what it is that the U.S. should be doing, meaning that you can plant seeds, but you can't necessarily pull them up too quickly. Is that something, A, that you see that you would also suggest to the next president of the United States? Garden, but don't try to reap too soon because you're not going to get it as much as you think. And secondly, is that something that perhaps could be a joint U.S.-European mandate over the next 10, 15, 20 years?
Yes, when it comes to nation and state building, I distinguish between gardening and architecture. Gardening can be successful if you help prepare the ground for nation building and state building that the people of the society in question want to do and undertake to do on their own. You can't just build the institutions or the sense of national community by yourself. So the United States and Western Europe can be helpful, can be adjuncts to these projects, but the impetus has to come from within. And for such projects, when and where they are promising, it would be a good idea for the United States, in conjunction with the Europeans, to do what is in our common and collective power to do, which is not negligible, but which is limited.
And basically, the one partner, am I wrong, right here in your view, the one partner that we can probably do it best with? I mean, where else would we look for a partner to do that gardening work?
Only Japan in Asia. And Japan has problems has reputational problems in Europe that the Europeans do not have around the world.
Let me close the discussion, Michael, if I might, with another book that you wrote with a very famous New York Times correspondent by the name of Tom Friedman, that you worked with him on. That Used to Be Us, I think was what it was called. And there was a great deal of talk about the fact that the U.S. is not what it should be, could be, or must be. As a foreign policy specialist, you spend a lot of time thinking about what our impact on the world is going to be. But we do have, it seems to me, on everybody's calendar, a November 8 election. Most people say it's going to be another indication of how far we have been polarized. Some people compare it to 1860. How would you talk to a European audience, as we do here at AICGS all the time, about how sustainable our political system here is in terms of providing the consensus for the foreign policy that you've just advised we have? How worried are you about our capacity to do that, looking as we do here in Washington, D.C., down the street at the Congress, but also looking at the country in general? Are you worried?
Tom Friedman and I wrote that book precisely because of this kind of worry. We say in the preface, this is a foreign policy book, even though it says nothing about foreign policy, because we believe in the American role in the world, and we believe as well that it will not be possible to sustain that role without economic growth. So we offer a number of suggestions having to do with infrastructure, entrepreneurship, education, and which are designed to improve America's economic performance, which we regard as, in the long run, a necessary, although not sufficient condition for this global American role, including stabilizing the security of Europe, the environment in which European countries operate. We published that book in 2011, and we hoped that it would be adopted for the 2012 election. In fact, we have a chapter which argues in favor of a third candidate and says why a third candidate could have a profound effect even without winning the election. It was a kind of thinly disguised manifesto for what we thought might be a Michael Bloomberg campaign. Well, he didn't run in 2012, he didn't run in 2016. Neither of the major candidates has really taken up our suggestions. So unfortunately, I have to say that for me, the prognosis for the next administration dealing effectively with the underpinnings of American foreign policy is not particularly good. It is, as I tell my students in American foreign policy courses, a kind of paradox or perhaps an irony that it is the American voters who ultimately decide what American foreign policy is to be, but it's people living in other countries who are most affected by it. The people who are most affected by the American election don't get to vote. There seems something, I won't say unjust, but somehow out of equilibrium about that, but that is the fact.
When you finally look at the next few years or so, you see out there a lot of fires burning, and you see us still being seen by many people, whether it be in Asia, whether it be in Europe, or elsewhere, certainly in the Middle East, looking at the U.S. as a fire station. It seems to me that one of the problems that you just put your finger on is the fact that we're having trouble making a case to the American public after, what is it, the longest war in the history of the United States with Afghanistan and Iraq, the sheer just exhaustion that people feel, which I think goes into the problem of enthusiasm about this election. People are just simply not particularly enthusiastic about either candidate. We're going to need a new narrative about why it is what we do is important for whom, including ourselves, but also the other people. One would hope that it wouldn't take another major disaster like a 9/11 to rattle people's minds about that. But at the end of the day, do you have a sense that over the next, say, 4 to 8 years, depending upon how long this presidential run will be for either candidate, that we'll be any better off in 2024 than we are in 2016?
It requires whoever is president to make the case for continuity, for international engagement, and to tell the American public that productive international engagement does not mean nation building. It's not Iraq and Afghanistan. It's the stuff we did during the Cold War, modified, which was successful and was not unduly costly. But so far in this election cycle, there is no candidate who's been willing to make that case. My own impression is that President Obama, having spent his entire adult life and political career in the exceptionally benign circumstances of the post-Cold War era, sees the world through the prism of Iraq. I don't know what prism Mr. Trump sees the world through, I guess his own real estate experience. Mrs. Clinton is better qualified for the new era in that she did live through the Cold War. But so far in her campaign, she has not made a sustained case for the kind of foreign policy that the United States has followed for 75 years, and that has been productive for our allies and for ourselves.
And I think the other side of that equation, which makes me a little bit worried too, is that you have a similar kind of problem on the European end of the equation, because everyone over there is worried about their own respective political careers and futures as well. That's not a good formula for a good, solid transatlantic consensus. On the other hand, there is this expression that you probably heard the colleague around the street here, Robert Kagan, said, superpowers don't get to take a vacation. And we need to face up to that. And I think that the Europeans have to face up to the fact that, yeah, they put 60, 70 years into making this European project, but don't take it for granted. And I guess that, generally speaking, that's what we shouldn't do on both sides of the Atlantic.
Well, the danger is that in response to the Kagan line, superpowers don't get to take a vacation, the American public will say, we want a vacation, so we won't be a superpower.
That could be a danger in and of itself. Well, let's hope that we can come back and talk about the next book that you're going to write, which may be a little bit more toward maybe mission successes, but we'll wait and see what you write about. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Good to